Have you ever had a client or a colleague say something like this? Why does that wireframe have a big box with an X in it? Why is there lorem ipsum text? Why is this design in black and white? Guys, I have heard it all, and I have created some ways that we can help explain the role of wireframes to our clients or colleagues who might not still understand what the heck wireframes are and the purpose of them. So we're going to get to that in just a few minutes, but first I want to introduce myself in case we've not met yet. My name is Doody, and I'm a user experience designer and entrepreneur, and I really want to help everyone learn to think like a designer. So one of the ways I do that is these YouTube videos where I try and answer your questions on business, design, and technology. And I also do a weekly user experience newsletter called The UX Notebook. You can grab that at theuxnotebook.com. Goes out every Friday with tons of articles, videos, links, all curated by me. Only the good stuff. I don't have time for spam, neither do you. So we cut right to the chase with the newsletter. But back to this topic of wireframes. So I know that many of you struggle with your clients and colleagues not understanding wireframes. And here's the thing. When it comes to making wireframes, I always ask myself, okay, who are these wireframes for? And I try and understand the end consumer of the wireframes and their, let's say, level of proficiency with wireframes, meaning how likely are they to understand that this is a wireframe versus a design. So I recently had a client, and after about the first couple of meetings, I learned that their company never used wireframes before. And the way that they designed was to sit over the shoulder of a visual designer who was working in Sketch or Photoshop. And this client would literally design over the shoulder and say, move this, change that, do this to the header, blah, blah, blah. And that was their version of the design process. So once I learned that, I realized, oh no, this person is really going to have a hard time switching into wireframes because they're so used to seeing all the visuals. So first of all, I kind of take the temperature and figure out, have they ever seen a wireframe before? If not, we're going to have to do a lot more hand-holding. So whenever I start a project, I always start with, let's say they are conceptual wireframes, meaning that we want to make sure we are getting the main content and actions and information on the page. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on the content. And there's a couple of ways to do this. Sometimes I just have a box that will say article text, or sometimes I would have a box that would just say newsletter sign up. So I'm not designing the newsletter sign up form. I'm not putting all the lorem ipsum text. I'm just literally blocking out the sections on the page. You could probably just do this in a bulleted list as well in a Google Doc, but sometimes it helps to see these blocks of where content will go. Now, would I do that with that client who had never seen a wireframe before? Absolutely not, because they would not understand that. But if I'm working with a client that I think really can understand the wireframes, I'll definitely do that blocking phase. So at the beginning of a project, though, when I do present the wireframes, I say to the client or the colleague, I say, okay, we're going to look at some wireframes. These are not designed. These are wireframes, and they're intended to show us the general hierarchy of information and actions on the page so that we can make sure we're not missing anything. Now, we're not debating the text on the buttons or any placeholder icons that might be there, colors, because there are none. It's just normally gray, black, shades of gray. And I always preface every design review with that. Even if it's the 5th time we've looked at the wireframes, I still like to give that reminder because sometimes new people will pop into the process, and if they have not heard that before, I like to remind them. Also, it's a great reminder to everyone else. So constantly reiterating that the wireframes are meant to be really a blueprint. I know that analogy is so cliche, but it's a blueprint. It's not showing the paint color of the room, where the couch is going to go, etc. It's showing the flow from room to room and where we intend to place the sink and the counter and the fridge. We're not showing that the counter will be marble or quartz at this stage. So sometimes it helps to give those analogies too, as cheesy as they are, because it just gives people an analogy. And once they hear it, they're like, okay, I get it. So the other thing to think about is what level of detail should you add to your wireframes? And again, it depends on the level of proficiency that you think your audience has to understand the wireframes. But also, I think it depends on what round of wireframes you're at. So normally, like I said, I start with this blocking where we're just putting article body text here, form here. Then as we do revisions, we add more detail so that it starts to come to life more and more and more. And then we're seeing the article text and the email sign-up form. Maybe I am getting placeholder stock imagery. Depends on the timeline and budget, obviously. I don't want to waste time, but sometimes that can be really helpful. One other tip that I have is to bring the designers into the wireframe review meetings so they can help kind of tag team with you, so that if the client or colleague starts to go down the path of, well, I don't like that color gray in the wireframe, which people have told me, the designer can kind of just play assistant with me and say, yes, this is the wireframe, and I'll definitely take that into account when we get into design. This is not designed, but we're going to take these wireframes and transform them in something beautiful once it gets to the design phase. So reminding people it's just a wireframe, reminding them to focus on the content, not the design, very important. But I think if you can lay those ground rules in the beginning, it'll hopefully educate people. One other tip I have is if you really get a sense that your client or colleague is having trouble with wireframes, here's what you should do. Find wireframes from another project you worked on, and then find the visual designs, or just have the URL ready and say, hey, we're struggling to understand wireframes, so I want to show you the transformation that a wireframe will go through so you can see that why we're doing this, and also trust us that it's not going to look like this wireframe in the end. So oftentimes I've pulled up wireframes from an old project, showed it to the client and said, okay, look, here's what we started with, and now here is the end product, the fully designed thing. And if you can show them that, that's huge in trust building. So I hope these tips will help you if you're struggling to get a colleague or a client to understand wireframes. And hopefully if you implement these tips, you'll also end up getting better feedback about your designs, because people won't be worried about the shade of gray or the font that's on your wireframes. They'll trust and know that that'll be handled in the design process. And therefore, they'll be able to focus on the content, which is what we want them to focus on. So hope you found this helpful. I'll talk to you soon. And if you want to get my UX newsletter, just go to theuxnotebook.com and you'll get your first issue on Friday. So thanks so much, and I'll talk to you soon. See you guys.